Your grandfather was born where?
In Celle, I think it's Cella, Germany. It's in northern Germany. My grandmother was born in Steinbach, which is down on the border between Bavaria and the Black Forest. Her parents she was a milkmaid. My grandfather, as far as we know from what he told me when I was a little kid, he worked for the Kaiser's stud farm, which was in the Lunenburger Heide. And that's, the Kaiser had kept all his horses up there, and he as a boy worked there. That's where they keep the breeding animals. The stud is referred to as the male, okay. The stallion, the stud. Charles William Christian Heidenreich. And my grandmother was Frieda Wilhelm Ulmer. She was Ulmer, maiden name was Ulmer. I spent a lot of my summers before I got in high school with them.
On Fox Lake?
Yeah.
Do you remember what your grandfather's brother's name was?
Chris. I never met him because he died before I was really paying much attention.
But your grandfather came over in 1870-ish? And
somewhere in that era. And how he got here, I don't know, except he probably... The Lunenburger Heide is a plain between Hanover and Hamburg. And he was, if you lived there, the North Sea was right north there, and that was a big harbor. I forget the name of it, but that was where a lot of immigrant ships left for the United States. He did not. None of my ancestors came into Ellis Island. They all came way before that ever was established. As far as I know, it was they say Philadelphia.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure if there's a port there or somewhere in Pennsylvania. Most of this, other than the pictures, is hearsay. They had 3 kids, and one of them died in childbirth, and this was my father.
Here on the right?
That would be your great-grandfather. This was my father when he was in the World War I.
He's on the right here?
Yeah. He was in the medical corps attached to the field artillery. See, each division had their medical, and that was him.
And where did your father grow up?
In Chicago. And then he went to work, and then went to night school with IIT, or Illinois Institute of Technology. Got a degree in industrial engineering. And he worked as an industrial engineer. But they moved to Berwyn. They didn't live in Chicago, and that's where I was born, in Berwyn. It's a town west of Chicago.
Okay.
Let's see here.
So, were you the 3rd Charles Heidenreich, or were there more Charles before your...
There were your great-great-grandfather, Charles, the one I showed you.
Yes.
His name in Germany was Karl.
Karl.
The English is Charles. Okay. My father was Charles, and I'm the 3rd one that we know of. How far back it goes beyond that, I don't know.
You didn't want to name Mom Charles?
Well, my name was Charles John.
Right.
And so we gave her the initial of Cheryl Jean, CJ. And she was the firstborn, of course.
So you're Charles John, yeah. And your father was Charles Adolph.
Right.
Okay.
And his father was Charles William Christian. But see, John was my mother's father's name.
Oh, okay.
So I was named after both grandfathers. Yeah,
there they are.
This was their 50th wedding anniversary. My grandmother was a real tiny woman. She weighed about 95 pounds.
Wow.
She was a milkmaid. They had a picture of her house. They had the cows downstairs and the flower boxes and the...
Do you know how old they were when they came to the U.S.? Like, roughly?
I think they were roughly in their late teens.
Okay.
Or early 20s. I think my grandfather was probably in his late teens. My grandmother has more records of her immigration, but she's probably... See, Germany was having a terrible, terrible depression in those days.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of immigrants coming from Germany. And they both ended up taking over from the East Coast, ended up traveling west, and they ended up in Chicago. My grandfather worked on a farm west of Chicago. And then he took care of the horses. He drove wagons because he was trained with horses.
Because of the stud farm that he helped with in Germany?
Know, because he told me that when I was probably 10, 12 years old, kids at that age, and my mother's mother, your great-grandmother, came from Stolf, Germany. It was in Pomerania. It was... the town she came from was... they'd bring over these young girls to work for 7 years for a wealthy family to pay for their... What would they call this? I forget them.
Like a nurse?
Housekeeper, nurse. Yeah. And she came that way as a teenager. Her name was Emily Bondemer, and she was from Stolp, S-T-O-L-P. And then my mother's father, was in Chicago working, and they met. And how they ever got together, no one knows, because my mother's father was born in the United States. His parents were born in the United States, his grandparents. And my mother's great-great-great-grandmother was born in Virginia before the Revolutionary War. That's recorded, that's verifiable. But she married a man in Virginia who, the family story was he was a Hessian soldier. The Hessians were...
I've heard this story,
brought by the British too. And so most of them deserted. They didn't want to go back to Germany. And so he was a Hessian. And then it went down the generations until my mother, which would be your great-grandmother, her father then married
Emily.
Emily.
And what was his name, Emily's husband?
Bondemer. No, Hensel. She married Hensel.
Hensel.
Her maiden name was Bondemer.
And
this was her brothers in Germany. Emil. See, they were in the military. Germany was very militaristic in those days. See? Because her name was Emily. Winnie's name is skipped, but then Cheryl got the name Emily again. This is Carl. He was in the military. This is August. He was in the military. And this was Friedrich.
These were all the Bondemer siblings?
These were all her brothers. That's it. And so that comes down to Winnie and I.
What, when she married Emily, what was the name that she took on?
His name was Hensel.
Hensel's...
That's a Hessian name, John Hensel. See, okay. Hensels were from Hesse, the province of Hesse in Germany.
Okay.
And these were the ones that were recruited by the British in
the Hessian
World War, in the
Revolutionary
War. So three of my ancestors my grandparents were from Germany.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth one goes back to Virginia, which we assume was English, because that was a Virginia colony before the Revolution.
Right.
When I knew you were going to ask this, I began to try to categorize. That box is all full of memorabilia. I was born in 1927 in Berwyn, Illinois.
Wow, this is great. Thank you.
My grandparents lived in Ingleside or Fox Lake, as I said, and I spent most of my summers as a youngster in there, in the house that my grandfather built in 1918. See, my mother's father was also on Fox Lake, but he didn't live there year round.
Oh, but your parents did.
He had a shack on an island there. Nice. And so those were my growing up years. And as a here where I started high school in 1941. And between my freshman and sophomore year, I worked on a farm west of Berwyn, about 15 miles west, which was, we call it the Stanton farm because it was owned by Stantons. And he had a farm, but he also had about 20 horses. And
you worked with the horses in high school?
Well, I was between my freshman and sophomore year, and I stayed with them all summer. And the house they lived in was the first stop on the Butterfield stagecoach going west of Chicago. It was the original stage house, which was interesting. Then in my next year, I went back out there to the farm and spend the summer with this. They were getting old. They were a couple probably in their 70s. So I was milked the cows, chased the hogs, trained the horses. That's my first experience really
with animal training.
And I have pictures of this. I have pictures of all of these. And then between my junior and senior year, I went to Idaho and worked in the Forest Service. And then came back and got drafted in 1945. But I was put in the reserves because I enlisted in the Navy, and so I had to wait until the fall of 45. And I then went in the Navy. It was turned 46, and I was there between 46 and 47, and I was a medic. So these are what they call dog tags. You got these when you went in. I got two of them, one for whites and one for... See, I got my number on there. And I've made several trips. I'll go through that later if you want. And ended up in Pearl Harbor.
What is this?
It's you're nominated in Seafaring Men, Lubbers, and All Living Creatures of Land and Sea. U.S. Charles J. U.S. Navy. A newcomer entered the royal dominion of the Hawaiian in true Hawaiian. Kiss the hula girls and everybody. In other words, it indicates you crossed the sea and came to the islands of Hawaii. This is after I got out of the Navy when Woody and I were dating.
Where was this taken?
I don't know. That was taken on a beach, I think. This is my great medal, World War II.
Wow. Why did you get this medal?
when I got discharged.
Did everyone get this medal when they were discharged?
If they were honorably discharged, yeah.
Okay.
And then also got these were my ribbons you wear.
Mm-hmm.
See, that's the same as that one.
Mm-hmm.
That's World War II medal ribbon. And this is the Pacific Theater.
Hmm.
I went to boot camp in Norfolk, Virginia. That was a Navy base in World War II. And then I went to medic school in Bainbridge, Maryland, and got my beginning rating. And then
Oh, that's cool.
moved up and got, this was a pharmacist mate. They called them pharmacist mate then. Pharmacy was just a part of it. It was like a medic, what they call a physician's assistant now, except we didn't have a physician, we were on our own.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, and this was on your arm. See, but this was a medic, but it was he became a corpsman second class, a corpsman first class, and then you took more tests, and you actually got your first assignment, and you became what they call the pharmacist mate third class. That was a non-commissioned officer. But before I got there, I went to Norfolk, and then I went to the medical training program in Bainbridge, and then I went to a hospital in St. Albans, which was in Long Island, New York. And then from there they assigned me to Sand Street. It was the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and I worked the night shift as the medic in the sick bay. It was like an emergency room.
And
we didn't have any nurses. I was it. And
this was 1945?
46 by the time I went through all of this. Eventually I got discharged. And this was what they called the ruptured duck. This was the honorable discharge you sewed on your dresser uniform and on your whites.
So how is that different than this medal?
This shows what service you were in. This shows that you were in the Navy.
Okay.
This is just like a veteran's.
Okay.
You got that. You know, I got another button here. A little.
So did you sew these on?
You sewed
And
them
then-
on your uniform.
And then you have since taken them off?
Yeah.
Okay.
This was on my whites, and this was on my dress blues.
So the blues were the
Formal.
formal?
So that takes care of my medical service, and I got discharged. Well, I was in Long Island, then I went to the submarine training up in Connecticut, New London, Connecticut, and from there they sent me to Mare Island as a transfer point. That was in California, and from there up to Vallejo, which was the point of debarkation to the submarine base in Pearl Harbor. So I moved all around. When I left Vallejo, I was the only one being transferred to California. And so they gave me a train ticket to go from Connecticut to New York, New York to San Francisco, down to LA. And I was the only one. I went all by myself.
Really?
People say, you were transferred in the Navy by yourself? I said, yeah. I never was transferred with a group. I always went alone. Very, very uncommon.
Very uncommon.
Because I was always assigned hold this. No, it was very uncommon. In fact, nobody believes that it was true. Can you follow us? I'll show you some of these others. This was my father's. I think there was something else here. Yeah. Oh, well, you can take that. My mother wrote this when he died. This was his discharge from medical corps.
That pin?
Yeah. See, this is the caduceus, the medical symbol.
Mm-hmm.
This was a machine gun symbol in World War I. My mother's brother, John George Hensel, as in the machine gun corps with the U.S. And he was in Europe. This was my mother's brother.
Wow.
She had 6 brothers, and one of them died, and 3 of them were in World War II, and two of them came back and died from the disease. Well, these are all buttons. Every place I worked, they gave me a button. When I came out of service, then I started my career. In 1950, probably she'll correct me, I went to the University of Illinois in Urbana, and I was there. I went there, and when did I went there in 40s?
Well, you were at MJC for...
I was there 3 years to get my BS degree.
You got your BS in 3 years?
Yeah.
And
well, you already had...
I had credits.
Some credits.
And so I was there essentially 3 years, and I left there in 19...
What did you get your BS in?
Yeah, I got a BS.
In what?
Animal science. Then I went to South Dakota State University and got a degree, master's in animal science also,
MS.
with genetics as a kind of a minor. And I have a lot of stuff over there.
Do you have pictures here? Because I have pictures in an album somewhere too.
Well, these are the publications.
Yeah, okay. That's
You
more
can-
important.
I'll just show you some of the things that
Yeah, go ahead.
he did at South Dakota. But when I was a graduate student at South Dakota for 2 years to get my master's, I published one paper. It was a project with hogs in the winter.
Yeah.
And South Dakota had a lot of immature corn,
Yeah.
which had not matured because of an early frost. And the question the farmers had is, what did they do with that corn? Mm-hmm. And I ran an experiment to see if it could be used by hogs for feed.
For feed for hogs?
And it was called Feeding Immature Corn to Swine.
Yeah. I typed that. I remember that.
And it was published in the journal. But as you see, this is not sorted very well. That was my first publication. And it was also, I don't know if, I think that worked as my master's thesis.
It was feeding...
Immature.
No, it was feeding growing, fattening hogs on immature soft corn or something. I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
but that was an interesting project because the farm was about 3 miles out of town, and in the winter it was almost impossible to get out there. So a couple of times I had to hitch up a team of horses
Really?
and get out there, and the hog house was just covered with snow.
This was in South Dakota?
Yeah, that was a fun thing. That was South Dakota, and I got my master's there.
Which took 2 years.
No, actually it took 3 semesters.
Oh, okay,
And-
only 3 semesters.
And in Christmas of the time I was there, that's when we got married in 1951. I went back to Illinois and we got married in the village church of Western Springs, Billy Graham's first church. And then when he came back with me and she worked, and I got my degree in the spring, and I had several offers for graduate school, and I went to the University of Missouri at Columbia. Well, I moved in the spring, I think, and I started classwork in the fall.
And that was 50,
53,
53.
yeah. And I was there until 54, 55, 56, and I got my PhD. But then, there, the department chairman was very generous, and he kind of liked us. And so instead of getting a graduate assistantship, I got an instructor's rating. So that meant more money. I was an instructor
And this was while you were studying?
while I was working on my PhD.
While you were a PhD candidate?
Yeah. And a lot of things went on in Missouri in those 4 years. Sorry, what?
Why did you choose Missouri for your PhD?
Because they had an interesting program which I could follow, which later became known as comparative medicine. And the University of Missouri was one of the first major universities that offered an interdisciplinary team of individuals to do comparative medical research in veterinarian school, School of Agriculture, and the medical school, were all on that campus.
So it was a team of these disciplines?
Well, it was, at that time, I was just had my advisors, and we worked out my program. And I took a lot of research procedures, audited some courses in the medical school, and some courses in the veterinarian school, and came out with a degree in, I guess you'd call it large animal physiology.
Your PhD
Yeah.
in large animal physiology?
Where is it? Look at it. I don't even know if it's on there.
So how is that different from, because you weren't a veterinarian.
No, but they were starting a veterinarian school.
Okay.
And so if I wanted to learn the physiology of animals, I went to took a course, audited veterinarian physiology. If I wanted to learn the anatomy of humans, I went in the medical school and audited courses. The one I got audited was a human anatomy where they took a cadaver apart, studied all that. And then the rest of it I took in the college of, I was in every different school there.
Agriculture?
No, most of it was in chemistry.
Seems like you spent all your time in the chem lab.
I took endocrinology, biochemistry, hormonal chemistry, many chemistry courses, advanced chemistry courses. Yeah.
Wow.
And then had a proficiency in German. So they waived that if I had proficiency in statistics. But then I had a proficiency in French.
Well, say that again? You have proficiency
For a PhD back in those days, you had to be proficient in 2 languages.
Really?
And the languages were either German or French. I think those were the only 2.
I think so.
So I took proficiency in French. Proved that.
You had one course in French.
That was when I was in college.
Well, you had to take it in college.
In BS, I was.
Yeah, you had to take a language, so that was it.
So I just got to the PhD, and I had to go to the language department, and proficiency that I could use French.
Well, basically, I think it was so they could read journals.
Read scientific journals.
So a lot of that was in journals. A lot of it is understandable.
It's Latin, French has a lot of Latin.
It's understandable, but he did.
And then when it came to taking German, I was taking all of these statistics courses. I had 3 or 4, and I went and said, couldn't I take a substitute for German in statistics? So the head of the department there, that was a different department, said, well, we can work that out. Do you know any German? I don't know what I said. I said, yo, sure, how much do you want to know? And he said, okay, that passes. You take your statistics. And it was interesting because I had some professors in all the different colleges that were really outstanding. That's why I went to Missouri too. I could get some professors that were well known in their field. Some of the books I got yet on the shelf and at the dining room are written by them. Bioenergetics and Growth was on my committee, and he was a Russian, came from Russia, Jew.
I think you've told me about this guy
Very
before.
sharp.
Is this the guy that took naps during the middle of the day?
He was on my PhD final exams. You know, they take about, I don't know how many weeks they took. About 4 or 5 weeks. And
It took 4 or 5 weeks for them to...
no, you had to write exam. Each professor on your graduate committee, I had 5 professors, gave me a series of questions to write answers to. And then you go orally before the committee. And this Sam Brody, you know, each of them quiz you. You know, Sam Brody saved my life. The committee was all set to ask me all these questions, you know. And he started at the beginning, since he was a well-known professor, long-standing. And they said, well, Dr. Brody, you questioned Mr. Heidenreich. I said, no, he's perfectly okay. I have no questions for him, pass him. And all the rest of them sat there. And they couldn't say much, you know. So it was kind of a farce.
Usually it takes a long time, but
It could have taken, you know, because it was.
yeah.
So, because Dr. Brody knew you so well, he just decided to give you your PhD?
We got along well, and you can show Evan the book he wrote. It's interesting. But he was such a major factor that they just didn't dare.
Question is...
And he spoke with hardly could speak English. You know, he came from Russia as an adult, and he got a research appointment at the University of Missouri, and it was funded by private companies, and so he's a great guy, but he had quite an influence.
So did you publish this before you received your PhD? This was while you were a PhD candidate?
It was published after I left, but the work was done when I was
when you were studying there?
And that's the one where that sign ties in. This sign, I had a whole bunch of publications at Missouri, but that was one of them. This sign here, I could tell stories, just go on for a month. This was made from a walnut beam in an old torn down barn south of Columbia, Missouri. And when I was doing the research, I had a lot of pigs on experiment.
When you were doing the research
Yeah,
for the
for that.
carcass evaluation?
Yeah, because I'd had to raise the pigs and then slaughter them and evaluate the fat, the protein, the muscle, etc. And the young man who worked for me was a typical Missouri boy. He grew up in the farm and real calm. And he would help feed the pigs. And at Christmas, this guy had carved this and gave this to me as a Christmas present.
He carved that by hand?
Yeah, from a wall.
The
first one he made, he spelled my name wrong. That's true. And he gave that to me as a Christmas present. And he was just working for me, feeding the hogs. And that boy was Missouri 50 years ago was really a backward kind of rural country. You know,
What do you mean by that?
how would you explain it? Winning.
Well, there were still sharecroppers, if not exactly in the area that we were in, but if you went down further
South.
And at that time, blacks were segregated. There was a black section in town, and
Without any sewers.
it was very, very different. In fact, we had an experience. He had there were a couple of Indian students there as well. And they went down into town to get a haircut, and the barber wouldn't serve them because they thought they were black. They were black, they were dark.
When you say Indian, do you mean Native American or from India?
Indians.
Well, there are other pictures at publications, but
So, do you know how many publications you did while you were at Missouri?
as a graduate,
If you had to
I gave
guess.
some papers at scientific meetings. I think I published 2 like that. Those are experimentation bulletins. Those are published by the university. Probably about 3 or 4.
While you were a PhD student?
Yeah.
And then you did one at South Dakota?
Yeah, when I started my master's. And when I got my PhD, I went to the livestock show in Chicago, and we had our animal science meetings at downtown in Chicago, and we present papers. I was still a PhD at Missouri, and I met the chairman of the department sitting in the lobby of the hotel in Chicago. And I started talking to him, and one thing led to another. This was November. And he said, I said, I'm looking for a job. He said, would you like to come to Purdue? Yeah, that was Claude Harper. And I said, well, that sounds good, but I won't complete my PhD until the spring of the following spring. That was in 56?
Yes.
He said, that's okay, Charlie. You just call me when you're ready to go to work. And then I did, and he said, you come on, we'll put you to work at Purdue. So I had looked at other schools, and so I went to Purdue. And he said, well, we'll make you a livestock extension specialist in sheep and beef cattle, working for the USDA stationed at Purdue.
How did you feel about that?
I knew something about it, but I didn't know enough to be an expert. And so I had a push, I'll tell you. And I took a sheep shearing course from one of the top guys with Sunbeam, and I became a sheep shearer. And then I'd go to farm meetings with cattle producers and give them hot advice. But then I finally made a hit, because testing bulls for performance had never been done much, and I started a bull testing station. And I so happened to meet a lot of buddies with this old department head at Purdue. And he called me in one day and he said, here, you're doing a good job, Charlie. And he said, well, we're going to put you on a different job. And so he said, now you become a professor of physiology and teach in the graduate school. Physiology. That was interesting. Is that right?
Yeah, but you missed an important part, because Claude Harper was going to give you a job after you got your master's degree.
No, I had to get my... Oh, yes, that's right.
And he said,
That was
you
3
go
years.
get your PhD
And then we'll hire
and
you.
come back and I'll give you a job
That's
then.
I've heard that story, yeah.
And then, lo and behold, I became medical comparative research physiologist. And they were building a new Herrick laboratory at Purdue.
It was
And,
named after the
and I
man.
was appointed Associate Professor of Animal Science and Physiology at this new laboratory. And these were engineers. The laboratory cost several $1 million because it was funded by Ray Herrick, who was the owner of Tecumseh Motor Company. In Tecumseh engine, they made small engines for, and he was a Purdue engineer graduate. And this was the horse barn converted into, and so I became the professor of physiology, and I taught physiology, became a member of the International Society of Biometeorology. This very prestigious organization. And this is my membership. And this was the conference I went to at Rutgers, and these were the, look at the attendees, where they were from Japan, Belgium, Germany, and here was one from, I was an attendee where they had my name, and I presented 2 papers. These were 2 graduate students I had at Purdue, and I'd always put my name second because I didn't think I needed any promotion, and I put them first so they got recognition. Ian Christensen was from Scotland, and Stan Curtis was a boy I had all the way through, but I presented these papers at this conference. Well, I had a graduate program then, and I had 5 PhD candidates, and we started publishing papers like mad. We published, I don't know how many papers, probably 20. I was looking for the list of them, probably 20 or 25.
And that was with your 5 students under you?
Yeah, I kept 5 graduate students, and I also supported them. I got money from NIH and National Science Foundation.
What were you teaching at this time?
Biometeorology, bio. One course, the graduate, postgraduate students. My students either had PhDs or were veterinarians or working on a PhD. I think I had 1 medical student. But that was one course I taught once a year. The rest of the time I spent in research. When they told me I was going to take this job with this Herrick lab and this, he built 2 chambers big enough to control all the environmental variables, and you could put animals in there.
At the Herrick lab?
Yeah. I started ordering classes so I could teach it. And I audited the first class I audited, it was in thermodynamic engineering. I forget who the professor was. Then I audited courses in meteorological phenomena, climatology. And I audited courses in swine production, so I knew how to use swine as experimental animals. And then I started teaching, and I've made it all up myself. It was a lot of work.
Wow.
Well, you sometimes work day and night in the Herrick lab.
Oh, yeah. Because we were doing experiments where
You were taking blood samples, or what were you doing?
we were studying. See, I was getting grants to do what they called comparative medicine, which would be applicable to humans. And that project, we were studying the embryonic and fetal death loss. And so we'd have to take the pigs by cesarean, be there when they were born and take them by cesarean, and measure different blood parameters and look at the implantation sites in the placenta and so forth. And when he got involved in that, I guess.
I used to take food over there or something, I can't remember.
Yeah, it was an all-night thing then.
Yeah.
So I became a swine obstetrician.
Obstetrician?
I delivered more cesareans than most doctors.
OB swine.
But we published a lot of research on that. I had several publications. It was concerned with embryonic death loss. In other words,
Like stillborns?
why a stillborn or often the embryo would die and you'd have a stillborn. What was causing that? And then from there I got into artificial insemination, and at that time they were starting to collect semen for breeding, and so we did several publications on how to store semen. See, you had to use fresh semen. The male would produce it and it'd be implanted right away. And so we did a lot of studies on fluid extenders, and that became interesting because I got some money from Rockefeller Foundation.
Really?
Because they wanted to use it in cattle, artificial breed cattle. And then we went to frozen semen in liquid nitrogen, and that became the standard of artificial breeding in all species.
Were there any other universities doing artificial insemination, or were you the leader?
There were some other universities, but I know we published some of the first papers in that, and that had a lot of interest in the pharmaceutical business. So I was getting grants from 5 different pharmaceutical companies. The last one I got was from the one in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Is that Merck or Upjohn?
Mm-hmm.
And they asked me if I would do some research. They had an idea to market a morning after pill, a birth control pill, because we had done research on
For
estrus
humans.
in humans.
Yeah.
Because I had published several papers on research in synchronizing estrus. If you could store the semen, you could synchronize the estrus and breed all your cows on one day by blocking the cycle.
Yeah.
And they've read the papers and they said, this has applications for humans, this birth control pill. They asked me to do research in that, and I said no. That was the first time I turned it down. I said, I don't believe that I want to be involved in. I said, manipulating livestock is one thing, manipulating human, that's all right, but not for me. I had enough to do. So I refused that one, but I had an ongoing contract with Eli Lilly, did a lot of research for Eli Lilly, because I was getting into pharmaceutical research. And then Pfizer, and Hoffman La Roche, which is a Swiss company. I had about quite a bit going. And then I said, this is enough. It's a rat race. And I resigned from Purdue. The rule was publish 6 papers a year. That had to be journal, edited, not just write up a paper in the newspaper.
Right.
And I published 6 a year, but I said I don't want that. I like agriculture. I'm not into medical and pharmaceutical research. And it was getting to the point, you have 5 graduate students working on PhDs, and I had a lab technician, I had a bunch of labs up in the, plus Herrick lab. I had,
So you had other labs besides Herrick Lab?
Yeah, well, we did the chemistry. That's where we collected the data. Then I do the chemistry. And the dean called me in and he said, why are you leaving Purdue? Nobody leaves Purdue. And that was Dean Earl Butts. He had just given up his position as Secretary of Agriculture.
Oh, really?
Under Nixon.
I think it's the other way around.
It was one or the other.
He became Secretary of Agriculture afterwards.
Afterwards?
And he said, why do you leave Purdue? I said, I don't know what I told him. I just wanted to do something different.
You wanted to teach is what you wanted to do.
Yeah, I said, I'm not teaching at all, I'm just doing research. 100% research. One course, graduate course for post-PhD students a year. And I went to Wisconsin. And
You went to the University of Wisconsin at Platteville?
yeah. And
Why did you choose Platteville?
Well, that was where the job was.
there was a job at River Falls, but I didn't want that.
Did that come later though? I don't, yeah.
Platteville was a nice community, right size, and they had just bought 400 acres, and
And then you had the opportunity of building
and
a
they
swine
said I
barn.
could build the
Swine
farm. So I took charge of the swine unit and the animal units. Build a swine unit. It got a lot of publicity. I don't know if I can find all these papers.
There used to be pictures, in fact, I think even Cheryl and I were in some of those where they were putting in the foundation for the hog house.
Why did they want to build this farm?
For research and teaching. And when I was the 2 years I was in extension with sheep and cattle, I also got involved with horses, draft horses, and I wrote articles in different draft horse journals. There's one article I wrote.
Well, and Evan, I think the other reason was it was a college of agriculture, and they had a farm originally, but the university proper started expanding so much with dormitories, etc., so it sort of took over the farm, and so they bought another hunk of land and started from scratch on the new farm land.
Okay.
And I don't know that they had ever had a hog facility, even at the old farm.
No.
There was a beef farm, and that was about it.
So one of the first things I did when I got to Wisconsin was to build a hog house on the farm.
And this was relatively new concept as well, raising hogs on confinement. So that's it.
And when it was finished, I had an open house, and this was the building. This was one of the things I did. And I was teaching courses out at the farm. This was the College of Ag. And this is me in one of my classes.
Look at that.
Opening in prayer.
Really?
No, it's what it looks like.
That's funny.
This was at the college farm.
So you had more students at Platteville, considerably more students.
Oh yeah, I have 75 students each semester. And they took them out to the farms, and I taught them all the hands-on experience with sheep, swine, horses. And then there was a demand for a horse course, so I started teaching a course in horse production.
So you started this rodeo team at the University of Platteville. Why did you start a rodeo team?
The kids wanted to, some of the kids, the boys wanted to compete. There's this is a college rodeo competition. All the universities have rodeo clubs.
Sure.
And we were in the north central region, and that covered Wisconsin through Wyoming. And not all those kids participated. And
That's really cool.
And this is one of the boys falling off. This was put on at the in Platteville at the Legion Field.
Did you ever compete?
That goes way back when I worked in the Forest Service
When you worked in the Forest Service,
in Idaho.
you competed in rodeos?
The war was on in 44, 43, and a couple of us went down to Sandpoint, Idaho for a weekend and went to Pendleton, Oregon, which was only about 75 miles east of Idaho was here in Oregon. And the Pendleton Roundup was one of the famous rodeos. And they wanted to continue it, and the war was on, and most of the guys were in service. So here comes a few of us guys from the Forest Service just taking a weekend off, like you would.
And you were, what, 16, 17 at this time?
Yeah, 17.
Yeah.
Because I graduated the following spring. Yeah. They said, well, you guys, we need to put a show on. Would you guys ride? We'll give you, I don't know what it was, $10 if you just get on the horse. So we got on the horse and they opened the shooting. So I knew, and that was
well, did you do barrel racing?
No, that was girls. This was bucking horse.
This was a bucking bronco.
It was kind of a monkey business because they couldn't get, riders. And so we would just climb on and get thrown off. It lasted for about 10 minutes and that was it. So I never, but I did have enough knowledge about rodeo, and then the guy who supplied all of this breeding stock for me to put the rodeo on had been a rodeo contestant at Arizona State as a student in the National Intercollegiate Rodeo Association. And so I called him and I said, we'd like to put a rodeo on. He said, well, I'll be glad to help you. And he supplied all the rodeo stock, hauled it to Platteville, supplied it.
Oh.
And his wife and Winnie did all the paperwork. His name was Mel Potter. And for 2 years he did that gratis. He said, I like collegiate rodeo. When I was a student, that was my big thing. And he said, I'll help you get for your boys. He had kids come from South Dakota, Nebraska. I think they got a few from Wyoming, a few from Wisconsin. Some of my boys. I had 2 boys did bucking horse riding, and it was interesting. One of them got on and rode, and he rode the horse right to the end when the whistle blew. And he jumped off and bowed. I thought, And he went home and farmed. In that calendar in the kitchen, 45 years later, every year I get a calendar from him.
Oh, that's the calendar you get in the kitchen?
Yeah, and that was
He was your student that bowed
he
after
was.
doing that?
And then Winnie and I went to his wedding over and another boy, he wanted to ride a bull, and they wrapped their hands with on that bull, and he rode and stayed on. They finally got him off. These were students, about 17, 16, 17 years old. They were freshmen in college, really, maybe 17 or 18. And he comes over and he says, hey, Doc, look, do you think something's wrong? All these bones were cracked.
All the bones in his hand.
From that rope. And he couldn't get it off, And he went on, became a veterinarian.
Really?
And I have a tack box out in the shed. You've seen that?
Mm-hmm.
That was made by one of my students as a gift. I have a telephone stand that was made by another student who was one of my students. So these were boys I had in class, and it was interesting because I could work with the students, and I had all boys. And you became kind of a pseudo-father for some of them because they had homes where they were opposed to what the boy wanted to do. This is a picture when I was doing research. I did research at Platteville in that barn I built. I did about 30 research projects. This was one of them. That's one of my students. And you notice in these years also I had enough students who were good in learning about hogs that this was an article published in a national magazine, 5 years in the making of hog manager's Platt story. And this is me and one of my students and one of my students.
Wow.
There were a lot of articles, but that was just one of them. This book is full of publications, but here's the Journal of Nutrition. Here's another graduate student, Reichert, and influence temperature growth rate and plasma ascorbic acid values in swine. This was presented in the National Journal of Nutrition. When I started to retire, I went to VitaPlus, yes, and then I worked at VitaPlus as a consultant for them until I retired from there. This is the retirement picture at VitaPlus. I didn't get these all mixed up, I guess. Now, let's see what we got over here. I have all these folders. I retired from Platteville in 1990. I had been consulting for about 10 years before that, because when I was at Platteville, they had told me the condition that I went there under, that I could have all the time I wanted to run my private consulting. So I had consulting, and I did a lot of consulting, but it was never in Wisconsin. As long as I was being paid by the university, I would not consult in Wisconsin other than free. I went to many, many meetings and gave speeches and stuff, but that was all gratis. That was as part of my job. But then I started consulting in Wyoming and had a long-going contract in Wyoming and one in South Dakota, Nebraska, North Dakota, those western states. In Wyoming, I got a call. Consulting's funny, you never know how the ball bounces. I got a call from a man who lived in Wyoming, was a geologist, and he was at that time uranium was a very speculative mining in Wyoming, and he made quite a bit of money buying and selling uranium mines, and he wanted to invest in agriculture, and he'd asked me if I would consider coming to Riverton, that's where he lived, and talk about setting up a hog operation. In the 70s, there was federal tax laws favored livestock investment. There were tax advantages. I won't go into all the details, and so there were a number of fairly wealthy people who wanted to have livestock because of a tax advantage, and they had some interest. And so I helped them design a building and bought the pigs for them, and send one of my students out there to do the day-by-day management. And then I would go out there and about once a month and visit with him and go through the hog unit and go through the records and so forth and any suggestions. And the student I sent out there, he was married, and his wife, I just hated it. I had a number of students who went to western states with married, and their wives would never. Wisconsin girls didn't like the dry desert with the West, or Texas for that matter. And he was going along pretty good, and we were shipping feeder pigs to a packing company in Denver, Weisbart Packers. And they set up a feedlot to finish the pigs, and then I helped them with that. We started consulting with Weisbarts in Greeley, Colorado. But then this fell in Wyoming. We had a good relationship for about 3 or 4 years. One day he called me, and they had baby pigs dying and so forth. Come out, what can we do? And these pigs just didn't do well, they were dying. And so he said, what can we do? So I was puzzled. And finally, I went out there, and I went up to, I forget the name of the town in Montana, where he was getting his feed. And I went in the cafe where the truckers hung out and to have coffee, and I happened to sit down next to a trucker who had hauled feed from Montana, wheat, corn, into Wyoming. And he was talking to this other guy, and I said, oh, he said, yeah, those guys down there, we've got a lot of I forget what it was, corn or wheat, had ergot, which is a fungus, because of the weather up in Montana. And he said, we can't get rid of that stuff, so we're selling it to some of these people down in Wyoming. And because they can get a good price, and he said that truckload of that, and so they had delivered feed to the guy that I was consulting with. I didn't say anything about that, but then
the food was contaminated by fungus.
Yeah, it had a hormonal effect, and it upset the internal balance of the pigs. And it finally ended up, he brought a suit against the feed company. Well, the feed company bought their feed from Farmers Union, which is a big co-op in Minneapolis, St. Paul. These country mills just operate with these subsidiaries, these big feed. And so it ended up that Farmers Union contested the suit. They said they had nothing to do with his behavior there in, I think it was somewhere in Montana, Glendive or something. And so the guy I was with said countersuit. So there ended up a suit between Farmers Union and this fellow I was consulting with. Well, that went, I had to go to Minneapolis and give depositions to the lawyers and so forth on his behalf. And the guy who was the authority for Farmers Union, the swine specialist, was one of my ex-students.
Really?
And I said, well, I'm working for the plaintiff and he's working for the defendant. They gave me the name. And it was settled out of court. It was finally to settle that they'd settle it some way, and I didn't follow that.
What year was this? It was in the 70s?
In the 70s.
Yeah.
And that was interesting, and then the next thing I was called out there, and his banker called me in, and he said, Phil has arrears in his financial fix. And what do you think about this hog operation? Do you think he'll ever be able to make money on it? said, well, Wyoming is not the place to raise hogs, but it wasn't my idea. I was just asked to do it. And so Phil finally dispersed the hog operation. And shortly after, he died. He was a typical, like an oil speculator, you know. They did all their business in the hotel over 3 sirloin steaks and 5 bottles of champagne. You know, real high roller. And I don't know, that was interesting. But then I also had a consulting job in North Dakota with the state senator, who was a senator in the state legislature in North Dakota. And he was setting up cattle operation on he had a number of farms. He was a banker and a senator and bought a lot of land. And we had a long relationship. I went up to Canada and bought cattle for him.
Wow.
It was all different kinds of things. I threw most of my correspondence away, but this is some correspondence. The company I operated under this was my company.
Livestock Research Associates.
Yeah,
That was your company, or?
that was my consulting company. CIL located it in Lancaster instead of Flatville. Here's a list of boar acquisitions that were made by Phil. That's the fellow who worked for me on the farm behalf. Here's Hayden Thompson, who was indicted for political life. Oh, this was the U.S., the federal government. They had the Aid for International Development. That was out of Washington, and they hired me to go to Ecuador and evaluate the livestock production. And because our government was loaning money for agricultural development.
In Ecuador?
Yeah.
Other countries too?
Oh yeah, Brazil, Colombia, mostly South America.
So, you went on behalf of the government?
I went down for the federal government and then wrote a report on the status of the livestock industry in Ecuador. That was in '74.
Was that because Ecuador was supplying meat?
No, it was
to
just
us?
it was a
Stimulus?
health program, Aid for International Development. And I had a friend who went to Brazil, and his family was killed in Brazil. And then I wrote a report here. Assessment of potential of a beef unit feed. Here's the Hoffman LaRoche. That's a Swiss company. They gave a recent meeting in Michigan.
I have a great deal of confidence in your delivery and hope we can work together more frequently in the future.
This is General Sales Manager of Roche Chemical Company. And then I retired and we moved to Fredericksburg.
To be close to our grandchildren.
It's a good reason.
You think that was well worth it?
Absolutely, I do. Yeah.
We do.
Then when we moved to Fredericksburg, I had a job.
Nothing. All we got was calling cards.
We were going to produce organic beef and convince the restaurants that there's a market for, in the better restaurants, higher price customers would buy organic beef It started and it's quite popular now, but we're a bit ahead of our time.
What year was this?
Probably 97, 98, I'm not sure.